I'm on my way to my next camping destination, and today I'm going to share with you my top 5 fishing from a canoe tips. Join up, let's go do this. Welcome to the backcountry. Okay, tip number 1. The rod holder. This is essential. Back in the day, you know what, the old school method was you took your rod and you propped it behind your gunnel, maybe use your tackle box, and you wedged it in there and you paddled out, and that's how it was done. Or you could grab your rod and fish it between your ankles. If you have one leg, one knee bent back, you can have the rod up against your knee, and then the end of your rod would be behind your ankle, and you just simply wedged it in there like that. But nowadays there's some good options, better than it used to be. Again, rod holders, when they first came out a long time ago, and I bet you they still make them, I don't know, they're basically just a metal C-clamp with a rack welded to the top of it. And boy, if you wanted to wreck the gunnel of your canoe and wreck the end of your fishing rod, those were the rod holders to have. But nowadays there's some good options. I have a few of them. This one here in particular is a Scotty. This is the number one thing for me to suggest to anybody: get a rod holder. Okay, so now I'm gonna put this on and bring it back on for tip number 2. Right, tip number 2. Your fishing rig, and specifically your drag. What I do with my drag is I turn it right down. My drag is very loose, and that's very important in a canoe versus fishing from a boat. When you're fishing from a boat, most of the time your rod is in your hand and you know what's going on, and if you get a hit or if you get a snag, you know immediately, or you're pretty aware of it. But when you're canoeing, you may be distracted with the beautiful scenery around you. You have your paddle, you're taking care of your canoe, you're minding your own business. And when you get a snag or you get a fish, you want that drag loose, because specifically for a snag, if you're in a windy condition and you have to maneuver around, you want that line to be able to come out easily versus your rod bending back and getting actually wedged in your rod holder. And that can happen where there's so much tension on your rod that you can't even take your rod out of the holder so you can manipulate it. When you're in a boat and you have a snag, it's simple. You throw it in neutral, you throw it in the reverse, and you back your boat up against the wind, against the waves, and you can reel up and make your way back out to where your snag is and work your snag out. In a canoe, that's often not a possibility. The wind is blowing you, perhaps you're in some waves, and you have to take care of you first, which is you and the canoe. And if you have to, you let your drag take care of it. Run your drag loose. That way, once you have control of your situation, you have your canoe turned around, then you can grab your rod and go back, paddle back to where your snag is and get it out. Always keep a loose drag. And if you have a fish big enough that it keeps pulling your drag out, it's a lot easier to simply turn your drag tighter than it is to loosen it up as you're wrangling a fish, that is. So loose drag. Tip number 3, and that is how you run your paddle. If you're right-handed, you're going to predominantly be paddling on your right side, which means you should have your fishing rod pointing to the right side. Here's what I mean. When you take a paddle stroke and I'm paddling on my right, automatically my torso is turned to my right. And if your fishing rod is on the opposite side of the canoe, that rod is outside of my vision. Because I'm paddling mostly right and I'm turned this way, my line, my fishing line and my rod, my whole rig is automatically within my line of sight. That way I can easily, quickly grab my rod when it's time to do so. If there's a fish biting, or if I'm catching bottom or something like that, I know immediately. If I'm like this paddling and I'm looking around, I'm enjoying the scenery, that fishing rod is always within my line of sight. And I have a friend one time that came with me, and this is a perfect example, and he was paddling on his right side. The rod was and rod holder on the opposite side, going the other way, and guess what? By the time he realized he had his snag and the drag was coming out, he turned around and that brand new, okay, that brand new ugly stick flew out of his rod holder and he lost it. He had no idea, and that's because he's facing away from it. So remember that. Always keep your rod on the same side that you predominantly paddle on. Okay, tip number 4 is your paddle. What do you do with your paddle when it's time to grab your fishing rod? What do you do? Here's what I do. I always have my paddle tucked in behind me. I paddle, I put my stroke, and let's say I have a fish that hits my line. So right away I take my paddle, I'll make a stroke, the paddle comes out of the water and it gets flipped right inside the canoe behind me. It's right back there in the stern. And now I have both free hands. I can grab my rod, I can manipulate my lure, wrangle my fish, whatever it is I'm doing. And here's a mistake that I still do from time to time. You're paddling away and you catch a fish, you got something going on with your line, and you grab your canoe paddle and you put it right across the gunnel. And there's waves, there's wind, you're bouncing around, the dog is moving around, you're wrangling, and your canoe and your paddle will slide right off the top of the gunnel and it goes right in the lake. Two things will happen. Either you lost your canoe, your paddle, it's out floating, and now the wind is pushing you the opposite direction, or you see your paddle taking off and you reach for it and now you're doing the teeter-totter thing with the canoe, you're moving back and forth and things are going crazy, and suddenly there's an out of control situation because you're doing all this while perhaps wrangling a fish. So always remember, when you paddle, I'm facing my right, I catch a fish, the line's something going on, I can easily, very quickly, drop my paddle in the back, done. It's secured, it's not gonna go anywhere. Now, a little bonus tip to go with that, which is equally as important, and that is your fish net. Now this paddle thing, I use that all the time, not just when I'm fishing. Your dip net, if you're wrangling a fish, and now your dip net, I keep mine on the opposite side of the canoe in front of me. So the paddle is behind me, secured, and now my fish is at the boat. I can easily reach down, grab my net, and then net my fish, versus having the net stowed away underneath other gear. Maybe it's got the tackle boxes on top of it, something like that. Always make sure your net is at hand and that you can grab the net with one hand while you're holding your rod with the other hand. You got two hands, that's all you got, you don't have a third one. Okay, tip number 5, and it relates to your fishing rod. What I like to do is when I'm fishing from a canoe is to use a fishing rod that's a little bit shorter in length. simply because it makes it easier to wrangle a fish at the boat. Sometimes you're going for a species of fish and a longer rod is preferred. I find that it's better if you sacrifice a little bit of that and you maintain a shorter fishing rod. When you're wrangling a fish at the boat, yes, you can pick up your rod, and you have to pick up your rod up to bring the fish into you. And one might say, well, because you do that, it doesn't matter how long your rod is. But it does matter. The longer your rod is, even if it's picked up in the air, it's going to have more bend on the tip, and the fish has a much larger circle that it can swim back and forth, and that larger circle means you're going to be chasing after that fish. So use a little bit shorter fishing rod. It stows, number one, better in the canoe than a longer one, and it's easier to wrangle your fish at the boat. Sometimes you have to sacrifice a little bit if you're going for a particular type of species of fish that requires longer rig. You may want to think twice and just try to keep it a little bit shorter. Now, if you think to yourself, well, I'm a tall guy. I'm not a tall guy, but let's say you are a tall guy and you say, well, I got a long reach. It may not matter to me. Well, I would be inclined to disagree. Taller individuals obviously have longer arms, obviously have a longer reach, and they may be able to alleviate some of this wrangling of the fish at the boat. But you got to keep in mind, the taller you are, the more you offset your center of gravity, and the more you reach out, the more your center of gravity goes off, and the more likely you are to have a misfortune come your way. All right. Okay, that's the 5 tips, but I got one bonus tip to share with you. When you got a nice little puppy like mine, bring a chew toy or a rawhide, or some kind of rawhide here. Keep your puppy occupied in the canoe while you're wrangling and fishing and enjoying yourself. Everyone, catch you on the next one.